with a little bit of it. Can you name any of the Greek gods? Like who read the Percy Jackson books? Right. Okay. What are some Greek gods?
Let's say Zeus.
Zeus.
Apollo.
Apollo.
Hades.
Hades. All right. Ares. Good. All right. So all right, we got an idea here. Now again, most ancient cultures are going to be polytheistic. You've got, much like Greek myth, which we're probably most familiar with, right? You've got different gods. They might have their own kind of sphere of influence. They can all kind of impact the world in various ways. Some gods might be stronger than others, but no one's really like super, kind of all powerful in the way that they can kind of control everything. All right, we'll go on the other side, maybe a little bit easier. Start with monotheism. What's monotheism? Anthony.
Believe in one God.
One God, one and only one God. That there is one supreme God, right? And again, monotheism is going to be the hallmark of many contemporary religions today. In the middle, and this might be the one that you might not have heard about, henotheism. What's henotheism? Jordan?
It's when one God is like venerated above all the rest, but
Right.
the other gods like still exist.
There you go, right? So that there's multiple gods, or multiple gods exist, but really there's just one God that has all the power. The other gods are still there, but they're almost kind of powerless when up against the big God, right? Okay, so in the ancient world, like I said, most cultures are polytheistic. We see some henotheism, right? And very little, but very important, monotheism emerged too. More on that later, though, right? The other thing that's important, cities and even states, right, kingdoms or whatever, they would have their own patron gods, right? And especially the starts at the city level, that cities would be associated with or have a special relationship with a particular god, right? And that god, even though they were one god among many, would, in theory, be looking out for their city. Okay? Who was the patron god of Athens? Athena, right? Athens, Athena, yada yada. Okay. So there we go. Any questions here? That's pretty straightforward. Okay. So, like I said, religion itself, what we would call religion, not quite use the word in the same way, it's about this interaction between humans and gods, right? Gods, the supernatural, they can directly influence the earth, right, the human world. Humans want to try to, kind of manage this interaction or try to make it as beneficial as possible. So, religious acts, sacrifices, ceremonies, rituals, etc. Generally speaking, so now I'm making huge generalizations here, right? But generally speaking, have kind of two elements or two components or two purposes. And we're going to encounter both of these in the class looking at Greece and Rome. Number one, you want to ascertain the mood of the gods, right? Are the gods in a good mood or bad mood? And this might determine if it was a good or bad time to act. Well, if the god was in a bad mood, then maybe I don't want to start a war now, because it's not going to turn out well. What might this sound similar to that maybe some people do today? Is it a good time to act or a bad time to act? You check, I was going to say check the newspaper, that already dates myself. You check your online app to look at horoscopes, right? Yeah. So something that we call divination. So again, you're not really asking for anything. It's just like sometimes the stars are feeling good, sometimes things look bad. I want to know what things look like before I act, right? So that's one part of it, ascertain. Then, second part, a little bit harder to do, you want to affect, right, the mood of the gods. Some things that you do make the gods angry. Other things that you do make the gods happy. So you can then have an impact on the god's mood, thus making things a good time to act or a bad time to act. Okay? Now, one thing that's important is that we oftentimes, when kind of thinking about this model, right? And again, because of the influence of more kind of contemporary modern religions, might put our own kind of ethical spin on this, right? Like, well, acting nice is proper, acting mean is improper, something like that. And again, there is some of that there. But kind of the ancient proper, improper doesn't line up one-to-one with more modern standards of, like sin versus virtue, or ethical behavior versus unethical behavior, right? We don't need to know a whole lot about that for now, right? Just think about it, that there's some things you can do, and you know what these are that can anger the gods, and other things that will please the gods. So, you want to act in a way that positively impacts the god's mood, because theoretically then, things in your life, things that you're doing that day are going to turn out to be better, right? Number one way of impacting positively the god's mood, giving the god an offering, right? Giving something to God. Most common offering we're going to see in antiquity, Greece and Rome, animal sacrifice, right? Killing an animal, sacrificing the animal, burning parts of the animal as an offering to the god. Okay? And again, we'll talk in more details about Greece and Rome and kind of what they did a little bit later. Okay. So the goal of all of this, right, of religion, is about maintaining order, right? That you want both the heavens and the earth to kind of function as smoothly as possible, because this means your life is going to turn out, I guess, as best as possible, right? If things get out of whack, if things get out of order, if you start acting at the wrong time, if the gods get too angry, right, then you get disorder and bad things happen. All right, Jerry.
What's an example of improper action?
Well, okay, so there'll be some things like, okay, murder, right? Then there could be other things that would be something like handling a dead body, right? So if you buried a dead body and then you didn't purify yourself, right? Again, the closest things might be like some religions, like dietary prohibitions, right? Like, well, you can't eat this at certain times, or certain actions are unbefitting a holy space, or things like that, right? But there's a much wider range, especially in the second millennium ancient at least, of things you can do or can't do. All right. So again, who are the ones that are kind of really mediating this interaction? There's a little bit of personal stuff, right? Kind of what you do in your own offerings are important. But the biggies, right? The ones who have the most weight, unsurprisingly, priests and kings, right? Priests, both men and women, right? Priests and priestesses, who are kind of the religious specialists, who have a special role with the gods, and the rulers, right? The monarchs, again, who are perceived as having a special relationship with the gods. That, the Pharaoh of Egypt has a different relationship with the god Ra than anyone else. And as a result, he has a greater impact on all of this. Everyone good with that? No question? Yeah, right, good. All right. So, last thing here about religion. In antiquity, there is no separation between religion and other stuff, right? I think many people in the modern world, right, most people, right, can view religion as something distinct. It's something that, even though maybe religious values are part of one's life, right, the act of participating in religion, or, is, you can say, well, this is a time for religion, this is a non-religious time, or something like that. Not everyone, right, but that's something that some of us might have that kind of parceling in mind. Some people in the modern world. That does not exist in antiquity, right? There's no notion that somehow the idea of that religion can be separated from anything else that goes on. Something like religion and state being two things apart from one another, right? Or the idea that somehow there's like multiple religions doesn't really exist, right? So it's the idea that religion is the supernatural in all of its massive, whatever it is, and it is constantly interacting with the world. You are constantly interacting with that. Everything you do kind of is, affecting the supernatural, everything you do is being affected by the supernatural. Right? Every action you do is, to a greater or lesser extent, a religious action. Not equal, not always the same, right? But that level of, you know, there's no politics without religion, and vice versa. Okay, questions here? Right.
At what age did the Israelites switch from polytheism to monotheism?
That's a hugely debated question. So I would say the general scholarly consensus at this point is that what is seen in kind of the historical documents in the first millennium BCE, right? So kind of right after this time, we're talking, we'll say about 800 BCE and stuff, that we see some Israelites who are strict monotheists and some Israelites who are henotheists, right? Who see the Israelite God as being kind of the supreme God, but there's still other gods that kind of exist that are kind of powerless, and that there is some tension between the two. And about 600, kind of the strict monotheism seems to be kind of the mainstream accepted view. So from the evidence, we can kind of see that. It's harder to talk about kind of earlier beliefs or earlier transitions because we just don't have great sources for them. Mom, question?
I was gonna say, so are you like saying that Jacob's descendants had like disagreements somewhere, like, cause I think he had like 12 sons,
Mhm.
different 12 tribes. So I'm guessing what you're saying is like some of the tribes were not as strict as the other tribes?
A little less specific as that. It's just that scholars looking at the kind of the examples that get used in scriptural texts and the way that kind of people talk about their religion, and other kind of historical examples that we have that are roughly contemporary, maybe a little bit later, sees kind of an internal dialogue going on. And really it's about what is the relationship between our national God, right? The God of the Israelites and the God of other people. Is this one God and it's the only God? Is it one God and it's just our God? But if it's just our God, then what do the other people have? Or and so it's trying to kind of work that out, which again, the terms here that we're using, kind of henotheism, polytheism, these are modern terms, right? But it's trying to kind of work out, well, there's agreement that, you know, there is this one kind of superior God, but what's the relationship kind of the other people of the world and other religious groups? And again, there's some people that see it more as, well, there are other gods, other people worship them, but those gods have no power. Versus there are others that are basically the idea that there's one and only one God. And it's moving what we call in kind of history, moving towards, although this is going to be a slow process, to a more universalizing religion. The idea that there's one God and this is a God of everyone, but that everyone can partake in this. Okay, right.
I just want to add on to what
Yeah.
I'm saying is that the idea of the 12 tribes of Israel descending from 12 sons, that's sort of akin to what we see in Greco-Roman cultures where, say, Caesar claimed to be a descendant of Venus, or Alexander claimed to be a descendant of Zeus. It sort of seems like the ancient Israelites had their own sort of idea of being descended from either God or a special person associated with God. It's sort of like everyone in the ancient world had their own ideology where we are descendant of this deity and this gives us a right to this land or sovereignty. It's like, when you read actual Old Testament lore, it's really just the Judean version of what every other ancient culture of the time had. So it's like, it's trying to say like, oh, 12 sons of Jacob created these different tribes who had this history. It's sort of, it's mythology that has been historicalized or validated with history rather than, you know what I mean? It's like mythology that was made validated over time.
So the one thing to add to this, and I'm going to speak historically, right, is that where things differ, and this is something that historians can't quite measure, is the measure of faith, right? So faith enters into the mean, enters into the calculus because religious is such an important part of the ancient world. And so one's own religious faith shapes the fact that how they interact with, say, for example, sacred texts. So as historians, we can't prove faith, right? I mean, that's by definition what faith is. So with the thing that, understanding kind of how people see and explain their own faith and their own religious background is going to be different than necessarily how an outsider would see it, right? And so it's kind of important to understand because that's an important part of history as well too, right? It's not just how others might have seen religious traditions, but how people themselves saw them and why they believed kind of what they did. Okay? All right. So again, religion closely intertwined with all aspects of life in antiquity. Everything you do, right, is, again, like I said, impacting the supernatural. The supernatural is constantly impacting your life. All right, so a little bit about politics and economy, right? Monarchy, a word that you've all heard. Rule by a single individual, right? Mono, meaning one. Arcane, coming from the Greek word to rule. Rule by one person. In English, we commonly call this person a king, right? They did not use that word, nor did every culture use the same word, right, to describe their sole ruler. There were lots of different names, right? But the idea of monarchy, there being one kind of sole, supreme political leader, is going to be the kind of default, standard political model in antiquity. And especially this time, the second millennium BCE. So in the Middle East, everyone is a monarchy at this point in history. But things are going to start to change a little bit. Okay? Now, it's one thing to say, I am the sole ruler, right? I can say that all I want. That doesn't mean people are going to listen to me. It doesn't mean people are going to do what I say, right? To be a successful monarch, you need the support of other powerful individuals, other people with power. We would say the aristocracy or the nobles, right? People that also are part of kind of the elite, upper status individuals, whether this is coming from birth, whether this is coming from wealth, right? Whatever it is that kind of gives them their authority and their power, you need them on your side, right? And it's not just, well, I need them to like me so they don't kill me. That's part of it. But you also need them on your side because they are going to be, in antiquity, kind of the core of your administration, right? Every leader needs a bureaucracy, needs officials to make things happen, right? Whatever you want to call it. I can say something, but unless I have other people out there kind of relaying my message, enforcing my message, collecting my taxes, upholding my laws, it's all going to fall apart, right? So in the ancient Middle East, kind of bureaucracy starts with the aristocracy, the other nobles, right? And then kind of trickles down from there. They kind of provide the first level of people who are enforcing and upholding the monarch. Okay, as we mentioned earlier, right, the king had a special relationship with the divine, right? A divine connection. Doesn't necessarily mean the king was divine himself or viewed himself as divine, yet kings were not the same as regular humans. They were special in the sense that their relationship with the gods or the supernatural was special. They could do things. They could sacrifice things that other people couldn't do. They were unique in this sense, right? So kings, along with priests and priestesses, were engaging in religious rituals, sacrifices, special, kind of ceremonies, you name it. Wow.
So would you say they were kind of like prophets or messengers of God?
They could be. I mean, again, there's going to be lots of cultural variation about what this relationship between the monarch and the gods, or let's say the divine, looked like. yes, that was possible, but not every culture kind of viewed it that way. That somehow the kings had unique insight into what the gods wanted. All right? All right, now, the palaces or the temples. So remember when we talked about Minoan culture on Crete, right? The so-called palaces. Or the Mycenaean palaces, right? Same is true in the 2nd century, or 2nd millennium, right? In Middle East as well too, right? They are going to be at the center of cities. They are going to be at the center of the economy, right? So that these structures were not merely political or religious, right? Centers. Again, these distinctions are these modern distinctions are kind of meaningless, right? They are also going to be economic centers. And we mean this in kind of every sense of the way. Literally, right? They were often the sites of, or right next to, like the central markets, where trading, right, took place, right? So they were literally economic centers. Economic business and trading often took place inside temples or palaces as well too, right? That they provided essentially big open spaces where merchants could buy and sell, okay? They're also the center in the sense that the people running the palaces and the temples, the kings and the priests, had a role in the economy themselves. And this is what gets called, and this is mentioned in the textbook, a redistribution economy, right? Now, every culture has, or at least part of their economy is a redistribution economy. A redistribution economy is the idea that, well, I am the king, or I am the government, I take things from you, and then give things back to you. That's the redistribution. I collect all of your taxes, and I give back public libraries and roads, right? So that would be, for example, a redistributive element in the US, for example, right? Now, the level of redistribution in the ancient world was much, much, much higher. Not 100%, and the book talks about it. They weren't 100% redistributive economies. But the level of redistribution was quite high, meaning that kings were controlling, or temples were controlling, large amounts of land, large amounts of goods, large amounts of wealth. And because they kind of controlled so much, right, they had an impact about how it was going to be kind of used, spent, deployed, handed out, etc. Right? So much of the economy goes through, again, the kings and the priests that, you can't take them out of the equation. Okay? There are elements of what we would call a market economy going on as well too, where people are buying and selling outside of the temples and palaces. Both exist, but this redistribution element is a big part of the ancient economy. So what are they redistributing, right? What are they taking in order to give things to other people? Well, again, unsurprising. Things like taxes, people might be being taxed. Tribute, which we might say money you obtain via threat. You don't want me to invade you, so give me some tribute, recognize my authority, and plunder that might come from warfare, right? So these are going to be big ways, especially tribute and plunder, of bringing money into the economy, which then the kings or the temples will then redistribute back, right? Through either public works, free food, land, etc. Okay, questions here? All right. So, there is my religion, politics, and economy, right? We'll go back to it, we'll talk a little bit more at the end of class, just to do a little bit of summing up. Now I want to shift gears, talk a little bit about primary sources, so that we can talk about the Code of Hammurabi. Okay, so, something important with primary sources, like this. You want to approach these differently than you approach the textbook. Okay? Textbook, as we said, it's an overview. You're reading for details, right? You're learning about important people, important places, important dates, important concepts related to the ancient world, right? The job of the textbook is to basically transmit information into your brain. Okay? Primary sources, a little different, right? So the primary sources we're going to be focusing on here in class, historical documents, right? Texts that were written by the Greeks, the Romans, or in this case, the Babylonians, right? You don't want to approach this simply as a piece of writing that contains information for you to learn, right? The way that you would approach a textbook. These are artifacts, right? This is how historians approach kind of historical documents like this, right? These are products of an ancient culture. And as such, we want to engage with them, not just the ideas that are, kind of being presented, but we want to engage with them as kind of objects in their own right. Okay? So what this means is it's less about reading the document, although obviously reading is part of it, and more about analyzing the document, right? Analyzing the document is trying to figure out what this artifact, what this remnant from ancient Babylon, as a whole, can tell us about the society. Part of that is what it says, but part of it is kind of the document itself. Okay, now this may or may not make sense, depending on how much work you've done with history and primary sources, but it's something that we're going to be kind of practicing, talking about, learning here in the class. Now, the way that I kind of teach it, there's 3 steps to primary source analysis. Context, interpretation, significance, right? That if you're following, or if you're kind of going through these 3 steps, you are then analyzing the document to answer this question. Today, I'm going to focus on context. Context is figuring out what it is that you're looking at, right? Is this a poem? Is this a law? Is this a speech? Is this a diary entry? Is this fiction? Is this nonfiction, right? That determines how you're going to read specific words. You can see the same words printed in a history book and a science fiction book, and they mean something different, even though the words themselves are exactly the same. The same is true here for historical documents, right? What am I looking at? What type of document is it? There's not really one answer to this. It's not like it's right or wrong, right? But just how would you classify this? You can start off and say, well, it's a written document. Sure. They're all written documents. What kind of written document would you say this is, right? How would it have been used in antiquity? Thinking about things about who created this and why they created it. For whom did they create this, right? What purpose did this document serve? And when and where? Okay? Where was it created? When was it created? Now, depending on your experience with ancient history, you may be more or less familiar with some of these questions, right? That's okay, right? We're kind of coming into this with the knowledge that everyone's a novice. For every primary source document, right? And hopefully you've noticed this, there is a background section, right? The background is basically giving you information about the context of the document, right? About who made it, when they made it, what it was used for. And sometimes there's some additional notes to help fill in some other stuff as well too, right? So before you get to the document itself, which starts under document, right? You're getting information about the context. And you want to take a few seconds just to kind of think about it before you jump into the text itself. What is this that I'm reading? Okay? Questions here? All right, so now I have an exercise for all of you. So what I'd like you to do is to gather together in maybe groups of 3 or 4. So people sitting around you, right? So kind of group up, 3 or 4, introduce yourself, say hi. 3 or 4, introduce yourself, say hi. I will be making you do this
What's up, man?
over the course of the semester. So.
I'm Anthony. Nice to meet you. Ryan. Yeah, you were in that last class, last semester, Roman law. Yeah, I think I was with you in that class.
Yeah, you were.
Yeah, I was all the way in the front. I was to the left. So.